She stole a warplane to protect lives. Now every branch demands her on their side. Sarah Martinez never imagined that her morning jog around Peterson Air Force Base would change everything. As a civilian aircraft mechanic working for a private contractor, she had clearance to enter certain areas but never thought much about the fighter jets lined up on the runway. That Tuesday morning in March, however, something was different. The usual bustle of activity seemed frantic, almost panicked. She slowed her pace as she noticed groups of military personnel huddled around communication devices, their faces tense with worry. Sarah had worked around military aircraft for 8 years since leaving her hometown in Texas. Her father had been a mechanic in the Air Force, and she grew up with the smell of jet fuel and the roar of engines. After completing her certification in aircraft maintenance, she found work with various contractors on military bases across the country. The Peterson base had become her home for the past 2 years. She knew the routines, the people, and the aircraft better than most. Her reputation for spotting problems that others missed had earned her respect among both civilian contractors and military personnel. Sarah was known for her attention to detail and her ability to work under pressure. As she approached the main hangar, she overheard fragments of urgent conversations. Words like evacuation, chemical leak, and no time caught her attention. A senior officer was speaking rapidly into his radio, mentioning coordinates that Sarah recognized as belonging to a small mountain town about 60 miles northeast of the base. Later that morning, while performing routine maintenance on a transport helicopter, Sarah learned more about the developing crisis. A chemical plant in the mountain town of Cedar Ridge had suffered a catastrophic failure during the night. Toxic gases were spreading through the valley, and the wind patterns were pushing the deadly cloud directly toward the town's elementary school and hospital. The problem was timing. Military evacuation helicopters were stationed at bases hours away, and civilian aircraft in the area lacked the necessary equipment to handle a chemical emergency. The toxic cloud was moving faster than anyone had anticipated, and weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Standard evacuation procedures would take too long. Sarah found herself thinking about the people in that town. She imagined children in classrooms, patients in hospital beds, elderly residents who might not be able to evacuate on their own. The frustration in the voices of the military personnel was evident. They had the training and the desire to help, but they lacked the immediate resources to mount a rescue operation. During her lunch break, Sarah walked past the flight line where several aircraft sat ready for deployment. Among them was an A-10 Thunderbolt II, a close air support aircraft known for its durability and versatility. She had worked on A-10s before and knew their capabilities well. The aircraft could carry external pods designed for reconnaissance and emergency supply drops. An idea began forming in Sarah's mind, though she initially dismissed it as crazy. She knew the A-10 systems, having spent months working on similar aircraft at her previous assignment. She also knew that the military's hands were tied by protocols and chain-of-command procedures that, while necessary for normal operations, were proving too slow for this emergency. As the afternoon progressed, reports from Cedar Ridge grew more dire. The chemical cloud had shifted direction again, and evacuation efforts using ground vehicles were being hampered by panicked traffic and poor visibility. The local hospital was reporting an increase in patients suffering from chemical exposure, and the elementary school was struggling to keep children safe while waiting for help that seemed unlikely to arrive in time. Sarah made a decision that would change her life forever. She had access to the flight line through her work credentials, and she knew the A-10 systems well enough to operate it. More importantly, she knew she could modify the aircraft's external equipment to carry emergency medical supplies and communication gear that could help coordinate the evacuation from the air. That evening, after most of the base personnel had gone home, Sarah returned to the hangar. She had spent the afternoon gathering emergency medical supplies, portable communication equipment, and other materials that could be useful in the rescue operation. Her plan was simple but dangerous. Take the A-10, fly to Cedar Ridge, and provide immediate assistance while serving as an aerial coordinator for the evacuation efforts. She knew the risks. Taking military aircraft without authorization was a federal crime that could result in decades in prison. She also knew that her flying experience, while extensive in civilian aircraft, did not include military fighters. The A-10 was a different beast entirely, with systems and capabilities that required specialized training. But Sarah also knew that people were dying, and the official response was moving too slowly. She had the skills, the access, and most importantly, the moral conviction that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. As she approached the A-10 that night, Sarah thought about her father. He had always told her that being a mechanic meant more than just fixing machines. It meant understanding that those machines served a purpose, often involving life and death situations. He had taught her that knowledge carried responsibility, and sometimes that responsibility meant making difficult choices. Sarah began her pre-flight preparations, checking systems she had maintained but never operated in flight. Her hands were steady despite the enormity of what she was about to do. She had studied the aircraft's manual extensively over the years, and her mechanical knowledge gave her insights into its operation that pure flight training might not provide. The base was quiet, with only minimal security patrols during the night shift. Sarah had timed her operation carefully, knowing the patrol schedules and the blind spots in the base's surveillance system. She wasn't trying to hide her identity. She knew she would be caught eventually. She just needed enough time to reach Cedar Ridge and make a difference. As she completed her preparations and climbed into the cockpit, Sarah took a deep breath. She was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. But in her mind, she could see the faces of the children and patients in Cedar Ridge who needed help that only she could provide in time. The engines roared to life, and Sarah Martinez began her transformation from a respected civilian contractor to the woman who stole a warplane to save lives. She stole a warplane to protect lives. Now every branch demands her on their side. The A-10 Thunderbolt II lifted off from Peterson Air Force Base at 11:47 p.m., its twin engines cutting through the cold mountain air. Sarah's hands gripped the controls with a mixture of determination and terror. Every system she had maintained from the ground now surrounded her in the cramped cockpit, their familiar hums and beeps taking on new meaning as she became responsible for keeping the aircraft airborne. The first few minutes were the most challenging. While Sarah understood the aircraft's mechanical systems better than most pilots, actually flying the machine required a different kind of knowledge. The A-10 responded differently than the civilian aircraft she was accustomed to, its heavier weight and military-grade systems requiring constant attention. But her years of mechanical experience helped her understand what the aircraft was telling her through its instruments and sounds. As she climbed to cruising altitude, Sarah activated the communication equipment she had installed. Her plan required coordination with ground forces in Cedar Ridge, and she needed to establish contact before arriving in the area. The modified external pod she had attached to the aircraft contained not only medical supplies but also powerful communication gear that could serve as a mobile relay station. Back at Peterson Air Force Base, the theft was discovered within 20 minutes of takeoff. Senior Airman Marcus Johnson was conducting his routine security patrol when he noticed the empty hardstand where the A-10 had been parked. Initially, he assumed the aircraft had been moved for maintenance, but a quick check with the duty officer revealed that no flights had been authorized for that evening. The base erupted into controlled chaos. Colonel Robert Hayes, the base commander, was awakened and briefed on the situation within minutes. His first concern was national security. The theft of a military aircraft was unprecedented, and the possibilities for terrorist activity or foreign espionage had to be considered. But as investigators quickly identified Sarah Martinez as the likely perpetrator, the situation became more complex. Sarah's service record was exemplary. Background checks revealed no connections to hostile organizations, no financial troubles that might suggest bribery, and no personal issues that would indicate a mental breakdown. Instead, investigators found a pattern of dedication to her work and a reputation for going above and beyond to ensure aircraft safety. Her colleagues described her as someone who genuinely cared about the people who would eventually fly the aircraft she maintained. Meanwhile, 60 miles away, Sarah was approaching Cedar Ridge. The town was visible even in the darkness, lit by the emergency lights of evacuation vehicles and the eerie glow of chemical processing equipment. The toxic cloud was a dark shadow against the night sky, its boundaries marked by the scattered lights of emergency response teams working to contain its spread. Sarah established radio contact with the incident commander on the ground, Sheriff Tom Bradley. Bradley had been coordinating the evacuation effort since the chemical leak began, and he was frustrated by the slow response from federal and state agencies. When an unknown aircraft appeared on his radar and began transmitting offers of assistance, his first instinct was suspicion. "Unknown aircraft, this is Cedar Ridge Incident Command. Identify yourself and state your authority to operate in this restricted airspace," Bradley transmitted. Sarah had prepared for this moment. "Cedar Ridge Command, this is Emergency Support Aircraft November 74 Alpha. I'm carrying medical, supplies and communication equipment to assist with evacuation efforts. Request permission to establish aerial coordination position." Bradley was confused but intrigued. His teams on the ground were struggling with communication issues due to the terrain and interference from the chemical plant's emergency systems. An aerial relay could significantly improve coordination between the various agencies involved in the evacuation. Sarah began her first pass over the affected area, using the aircraft's advanced sensors to assess the situation from above. The chemical cloud was larger than ground reports had indicated, and its movement was unpredictable due to changing wind patterns. Several evacuation routes that ground teams were using appeared to be in danger of being overtaken by the spreading toxins. She immediately transmitted her observations to the ground teams, providing real-time updates on the cloud's movement and suggesting alternative evacuation routes. The A-10 sensors designed for military reconnaissance proved invaluable for tracking the invisible chemical threat and identifying safe passages for fleeing civilians. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the emergency coordinator for the regional hospital, was managing the medical response when Sarah's voice came over the radio offering medical supply drops. The hospital was running low on specialized equipment needed to treat chemical exposure victims, and supply deliveries by ground were being delayed by the evacuation traffic. Sarah had anticipated this need. Using the A-10's external hard points, she began dropping medical supply packages at predetermined coordinates around the town. Each drop was precisely calculated using the aircraft's bombing computer, repurposed for humanitarian delivery. The supplies included chemical exposure treatment kits, oxygen masks, and communication equipment that allowed medical teams to maintain contact despite the interference from the emergency situation. As the night progressed, Sarah's role evolved from simple assistance to central coordination. Her aerial position allowed her to see the entire evacuation operation from above, identifying bottlenecks and directing resources where they were most needed. Ground commanders began relying on her reports to make critical decisions about evacuation, routes, and resource allocation. But Sarah's unauthorized flight was generating attention far beyond Cedar Ridge. Military radar stations across the region had tracked the A-10's movement, and the aircraft's unique signature made it impossible to hide. By dawn, news of the theft had reached the Pentagon, and multiple military branches were scrambling to respond to what was being called either an act of terrorism or an unprecedented case of military heroism. Major General Patricia Williams, commander of the Air Force's regional operations, found herself in an impossible position. Sarah was clearly violating numerous federal laws and military regulations, but her actions were also saving lives. The evacuation of Cedar Ridge was proceeding far more efficiently than anyone had predicted, largely due to the aerial coordination Sarah was providing. General Williams made a decision that would later be scrutinized by military courts and congressional committees. Instead of ordering Sarah to return to base immediately, she authorized a temporary suspension of enforcement actions, allowing Sarah to continue her mission while military legal experts debated the unprecedented situation. This decision had immediate consequences. The Army's disaster response teams were en route to Cedar Ridge but were still hours away. The Navy's chemical response specialists were being mobilized from their base in California. The Marines had emergency response capabilities, but were focused on overseas deployments. Each branch of the military had resources that could help, but Sarah was the only one already on scene and making a difference. As sunrise broke over Cedar Ridge, the town's evacuation was nearly complete. Over 3,000 residents had been safely moved to shelters outside the contamination zone, and the number of chemical exposure casualties was far lower than initial projections had feared. Sarah had logged over 8 hours of continuous flight time, pushing both herself and the aircraft to their limits. But her real challenge was just beginning. Multiple military branches were now demanding involvement in the situation, each claiming jurisdiction and authority over different aspects of Sarah's unauthorized mission. The woman who had stolen a warplane to save lives was about to become the center of an inter-service rivalry that would reshape military emergency response protocols. She stole a warplane to protect lives. Now every branch demands her on their side. Dawn brought new complications to Sarah's already extraordinary situation. As she circled over Cedar Ridge for what she knew might be her final pass, military aircraft from 3 different branches were approaching her position. An Air Force F-16 appeared off her right wing, followed by an Army helicopter gunship, and finally a Navy EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft. Each branch had sent their own response team, and each had different ideas about how to handle the woman who had stolen a warplane. The radio traffic became increasingly complex as multiple commanders attempted to establish authority over the situation. Colonel Hayes from Peterson Air Force Base maintained that Sarah was an Air Force matter, since she had stolen Air Force property. Army General Michael Rodriguez argued that the disaster response fell under Army jurisdiction, since they were the primary military branch responsible for domestic emergency operations. Navy Admiral Jennifer Walsh claimed authority based on the Navy's specialized chemical response capabilities. Sarah found herself at the center of a 3-way military standoff, while still trying to coordinate the final phases of the Cedar Ridge evacuation. Her fuel was running low, and the A-10 systems were showing signs of strain from the extended flight. She had pushed the aircraft beyond its normal operational parameters, and her own exhaustion was becoming a safety factor. All military aircraft. "This is November 74 Alpha," Sarah transmitted using her emergency call sign. "I have civilians on the ground who still need assistance. Whatever you're planning to do with me can wait until every person in this town is safe." Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the F-16 pilot, had been ordered to escort Sarah back to Peterson Air Force Base, but her words gave him pause. Morrison was a 20-year veteran who had flown combat missions around the world, and he recognized the dedication in Sarah's voice. He had never encountered a situation where someone had stolen a military aircraft for humanitarian purposes. Below them, the evacuation was indeed in its final stages, but several critical situations remained unresolved. A nursing home on the Yadu outskirts of town had been cut off by the shifting chemical cloud, and ground vehicles couldn't reach the 37 elderly residents who were trapped inside. The building's ventilation system had been compromised and time was running out. Sarah had identified the nursing home during her aerial reconnaissance and had been coordinating with emergency responders to find a solution. The building was too far from safe zones for the residents to walk, and the approaching chemical cloud made ground vehicle rescue impossible. But Sarah had an idea that would require cooperation from the military aircraft now surrounding her. "Air Force Leader Army Bird Navy aircraft," Sarah called out, addressing each branch's representative. "I need your help to save those people in the nursing home. The A-10 can't carry passengers, but between all of us we have enough lift capacity to evacuate everyone." What happened next would become legendary in military circles. Despite having no common command structure and representing different branches with different protocols, the 4 aircraft began working together under Sarah's coordination. The Army helicopter had the passenger capacity, the Navy aircraft had electronic warfare capabilities that could interfere with the chemical plant's malfunctioning sensors to provide better wind data, and the F-16 could provide high-speed reconnaissance to identify the safest approach route. Sarah's mechanical knowledge proved crucial in coordinating the impromptu rescue operation. She understood each aircraft's capabilities and limitations, allowing her to develop a plan that maximized their combined effectiveness. The A-10 would continue providing aerial coordination and real-time chemical cloud tracking, while the other aircraft handled the actual evacuation. The nursing home rescue became a masterpiece of inter-service cooperation, but it also highlighted the problems with military bureaucracy during emergencies. Each pilot was receiving different orders from their respective commands, creating confusion and potential conflicts that could have endangered the mission. General Williams, watching the operation unfold from the Air Force Command Center, made a decision that would have far-reaching implications. She contacted her counterparts in the Army and Navy, proposing a temporary unified command structure with Sarah as the on-scene coordinator. The suggestion was unprecedented. A civilian contractor who had stolen military equipment was being proposed as the tactical commander for a multi-branch operation. The debate that followed would later be studied in military academies as an example of how rigid command structures could impede effective emergency response. Army General Rodriguez was initially opposed to the idea, arguing that proper military discipline required following established chains of command. Navy Admiral Walsh was more pragmatic, noting that Sarah's actions had already saved thousands of lives and that the situation was too unique for standard procedures. While the generals debated, Sarah and her impromptu squadron completed the nursing home evacuation. All 37 residents were successfully airlifted to safety, with the elderly patients showing no signs of serious chemical exposure. The operation required precise timing and coordination that would have been impossible without Sarah's aerial perspective and her ability to communicate with all the aircraft simultaneously. As the last civilian helicopter departed Cedar Ridge, with the final evacuees, Sarah's fuel situation became critical. The A-10's fuel gauge showed levels that required an immediate landing, but returning to Peterson Air Force Base would mean facing immediate arrest. She had known from the beginning that her actions would have consequences, but seeing the empty town below her, knowing that over 3,000 people were alive because of her decision, made the approaching legal troubles seem worthwhile. The 3 military escorts formed up around Sarah's aircraft as she began her approach to Peterson Air Force Base. The flight back was conducted in relative silence, with each pilot probably contemplating the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. They had just participated in one of the most successful disaster response operations in recent military history, led by a woman who was technically a federal criminal. Back at the base, media attention was intensifying. News of the stolen warplane and the successful evacuation had reached national outlets, and reporters were gathering outside Peterson's gates. The story of a civilian mechanic who stole an Air Force fighter jet to save lives captured public imagination in ways that military public relations experts had never anticipated. Sarah's landing was textbook perfect, despite her exhaustion and the stress of the situation. As she taxied to the designated hardstand, she could see the crowd of military personnel, federal agents, and media representatives waiting for her. Among them were representatives from all military branches, each with their own agenda for the woman who had just demonstrated capabilities that their own emergency response systems lacked. Colonel Hayes approached the aircraft as Sarah shut down the engines. He had prepared for this moment during the long night, knowing that he would need to balance military justice with recognition of Sarah's heroic actions. The woman climbing out of the cockpit had saved thousands of lives, but she had also committed crimes that could not be ignored. "Ms. Martinez," Colonel Hayes said as Sarah stepped onto the tarmac, "you're under arrest for theft of military property and unauthorized operation of a military aircraft. But before we proceed with that, I want you to know that your actions tonight saved lives that would have been lost without your intervention." Sarah nodded, having expected this moment since she first climbed into the A-10's cockpit, but as she was led away for processing, she could hear conversations among the military personnel that suggested her legal troubles were just the beginning of a much larger story. Each branch of the military had witnessed her capabilities firsthand, and each was already developing plans to recruit the woman who had stolen a warplane to protect innocent lives. She stole a warplane to protect lives. Now every branch demands her on their side. The military justice system had never encountered a case quite like Sarah Martinez. As she sat in the holding facility at Peterson Air Force Base, federal prosecutors, military lawyers, and representatives from multiple government agencies were engaged in heated discussions about how to proceed. The woman who had stolen an $18 million aircraft had also orchestrated the most successful emergency evacuation in recent military history, creating a legal and public relations nightmare for the Department of Defense. Public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive of Sarah's actions. Social media campaigns using hashtags like E Hero Mechanic and Ours Save Sarah had gone viral overnight. The residents of Cedar Ridge were organizing rallies and petition drives, crediting Sarah with saving their lives. Major news networks were running continuous coverage of the story, with military analysts debating whether Sarah's actions represented a failure of military emergency response systems or an example of individual heroism transcending bureaucratic limitations. The legal complexities were staggering. Sarah faced potential federal charges including theft of government property, unauthorized operation of military aircraft, violation of restricted airspace, and numerous military regulations. The maximum sentences could total over 30 years in federal prison. However, her actions had prevented what could have been thousands of casualties, and prosecuting someone who had saved so many lives presented obvious political and moral challenges. Each branch of the military was conducting its own internal review of the incident, but their conclusions were leading in dramatically different directions. The Air Force was focused on the security implications of the theft and the need to prevent similar incidents in the future. The Army was analyzing how Sarah's civilian background had enabled her to coordinate a multi-asset emergency response more effectively than their own trained personnel. The Navy was studying her technical modifications to the A-10, which had proved more effective than many of their specialized emergency response systems. Sarah's first formal interrogation was conducted by Air Force investigators, led by Lieutenant Colonel Diana Foster, a military lawyer with 20 years of experience in complex cases. Foster expected to interview a reckless civilian who had gotten lucky, but she quickly realized that Sarah's actions had been carefully planned and expertly executed. "Walk me through your decision-making process," Foster requested. "At what point did you decide to take the aircraft?" Sarah's response was measured and thoughtful. "I spent 3 hours watching people die while proper channels moved too slowly. I had the knowledge, the access, and the ability to help immediately. The legal consequences for me seemed less important than the lives at stake." Foster found herself impressed by Sarah's reasoning, even while documenting evidence that would be used to prosecute her. The interrogation revealed that Sarah had extensively researched the A-10's capabilities, studied weather patterns and chemical dispersal models, and calculated fuel requirements and mission parameters with precision that matched military planning standards. More surprisingly, Sarah had anticipated the legal consequences and had prepared detailed documentation of her actions, including logs of her communications with ground forces, records of supply drops, and even maintenance notes on the aircraft's condition throughout the mission. She had conducted her unauthorized operation with a level of professionalism that exceeded many authorized military missions. Word of Sarah's competence and dedication was spreading through military channels, leading to an unprecedented development. Officers from all branches were requesting permission to interview her, not for legal purposes, but to understand how a civilian contractor had achieved results that their own systems had failed to deliver. Major Patricia Gonzalez from the Army's Disaster Response Division was particularly interested in Sarah's coordination techniques. The Army had responsibility for most domestic emergency operations, but their response to Cedar Ridge had been delayed by interagency coordination problems and bureaucratic procedures that Sarah had simply bypassed. "Your aerial coordination saved hours in the evacuation timeline," Gonzalez explained during her interview with Sarah. "Our standard procedures would have required multiple approval levels and coordination meetings that would have cost lives. How did you manage to integrate resources from multiple agencies so effectively?" Sarah's answer was straightforward. "I treated it like maintaining a complex aircraft system. Each component has a specific function, but they all need to work together. I identified what each asset could do, what the mission required, and then matched capabilities to needs in real time." This mechanical approach to crisis management intrigued military leaders who were accustomed to hierarchical command structures and rigid procedures. Sarah's background had taught her to think systemically about complex problems, a skill that translated remarkably well to emergency coordination. The Navy's interest in Sarah was focused on her technical innovations. Commander Robert Kim, an expert in military avionics, was amazed by Sarah's modifications to the A-10's external systems. She had essentially created an improvised command and control platform using equipment that wasn't designed for such purposes. The communication relay system you installed exceeded the capabilities of our specialized command aircraft, Kim noted. How did you develop these modifications so quickly? Sarah explained that her years of maintaining various aircraft systems had given her insights into their potential applications beyond their intended purposes. She had seen how different components could be combined and modified to create new capabilities, approaching the problem from an engineer's perspective rather than following established military protocols. These interviews were having an unintended effect on the military personnel conducting them. Officers who had initially viewed Sarah as a criminal were beginning to see her as a uniquely talented individual whose skills could benefit their respective services. The question was shifting from how to punish her to how to recruit her. The first official recruitment approach came from the Air Force. General Williams met privately with Sarah to discuss a plea agreement that would involve military service in exchange for reduced charges. The Air Force was particularly interested in Sarah's maintenance expertise and her demonstrated ability to operate their aircraft systems. "We need people who can think outside established procedures," Williams explained. "Your actions at Cedar Ridge showed capabilities that we want to develop within our service." The Army made their pitch through General Rodriguez, emphasizing their role in domestic emergency response and their need for personnel who could coordinate complex multi-agency operations. They offered Sarah a direct commission as an officer, specializing in disaster response coordination. The Navy's approach was more technical, with Admiral Walsh proposing that Sarah join their engineering corps to work on advanced aircraft modification projects. They were impressed by her ability to improvise effective solutions using existing equipment in new ways. Each branch was making compelling offers, but they were also competing against each other in ways that created additional complications for Sarah's legal situation. The military justice system wasn't designed to handle a case where multiple services were simultaneously trying to recruit the defendant. Sarah's civilian lawyer, Maria Santos, found herself in the unusual position of negotiating not just for her client's freedom, but for the terms of what was essentially a bidding war between military branches. Each service was offering different benefits, different roles, and different paths to resolve the legal issues stemming from the aircraft theft. The media attention was intensifying these negotiations. Public support for Sarah was growing, with veterans organizations and civilian advocacy groups calling for her to be honored rather than prosecuted. Congressional representatives were beginning to ask questions about military emergency response procedures and why a civilian contractor had been more effective than official military resources. Sarah herself was overwhelmed by the attention and the choices she was facing. She had acted on moral conviction during the Cedar Ridge emergency, but now she was being asked to make career decisions that would affect the rest of her life. Each military branch offered different opportunities, but they also represented different philosophies about how her unique skills should be utilized. As she considered her options, Sarah realized that her actions had exposed fundamental problems with how the military approached emergency response. The success of her unauthorized mission had demonstrated that creativity, technical knowledge, and moral courage could be more valuable than following established procedures. Now every branch wanted to harness those qualities for their own purposes. She stole a warplane to protect lives. Now every branch demands her on their side. 3 weeks after the Cedar Ridge incident, Sarah Martinez found herself at the center of a political and military storm that had reached the highest levels of our government. Congressional hearings were being planned to investigate military emergency response procedures, and her case had become a symbol of the tension between following rules and doing what was right. The competition between military branches for her services had escalated to the point where the Secretary of Defense had to intervene personally. The Pentagon meeting room was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Representatives from all service branches sat around a massive oak table, each presenting their case for why Sarah should join their particular service. Secretary of Defense Robert Chen presided over what was essentially an unprecedented inter-service auction for a woman who was still technically facing federal criminal charges. Air Force General Williams opened with a comprehensive presentation about Sarah's natural fit within their service. Ms. Martinez demonstrated exceptional skill in operating our aircraft and coordinating air support operations. Her mechanical background gives her insights that could revolutionize our maintenance and emergency response protocols. The Air Force proposal included specialized training programs, fast-track advancement opportunities, and assignment to their elite rescue coordination teams. They emphasized that Sarah's actions had already proven her ability to work within air, force systems, and culture. Army General Rodriguez countered with an equally compelling presentation focused on domestic emergency response. The Army bears primary responsibility for disaster relief operations within the United States. Ms. Martinez's success at Cedar Ridge showed capabilities that could transform how we approach civilian emergency coordination. The Army's offer included a direct commission as a major, assignment to their disaster response division, and development of new interagency coordination protocols based on Sarah's techniques. They pointed out that most emergency situations would involve ground operations where Army resources would be primary. Navy Admiral Walsh took a different approach, focusing on innovation and technical development. Ms. Martinez's ability to modify existing systems to create new capabilities is exactly what the Navy needs for our advanced development programs. Her engineering mindset could contribute to projects that would benefit all services. The Navy proposed assignment to their Special Projects Division, working on classified aircraft modification programs and developing new emergency response technologies. They offered the highest starting rank and the most interesting technical challenges. Marine Corps General Kevin Torres, who had been quiet during the other presentations, made his case last. The Marines need people who can think independently, act decisively, and accomplish impossible missions with limited resources. Ms. Martinez has already proven all of these qualities. The Marine proposal was the most unconventional, suggesting that Sarah could help develop new concepts for rapid emergency response that combined aviation, ground operations, and civilian coordination. They offered the most autonomy but also the most demanding training and deployment schedule. Sarah listened to each presentation with growing amazement. 6 months earlier, she had been a civilian contractor focused on maintaining aircraft systems. Now the most senior military leaders in the country were competing for her services, offering opportunities that most military personnel spent decades trying to achieve. But the legal issues remained unresolved. Federal prosecutors were under enormous pressure to pursue charges, while public opinion and political considerations favored lenient treatment. The case had become a test of whether the military justice system could adapt to unique circumstances that didn't fit standard legal frameworks. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Judge Advocate General Patricia Morrison, the military's top legal officer, proposed a solution that would satisfy legal requirements while recognizing Sarah's extraordinary contributions. Instead of traditional criminal prosecution, she suggested a new category of military service that would address both the legal violations and the national security implications of Sarah's demonstrated capabilities. Ms. Martinez's actions violated numerous laws and regulations, Morrison explained to the assembled officials. However, those same actions also revealed critical gaps in our emergency response systems and demonstrated capabilities that serve the national interest. I propose we create a new classification that allows her to serve the country while addressing the legal issues through constructive rather than punitive measures. The proposed solution involved Sarah accepting responsibility for her actions while agreeing to serve in a special cross-service role that would utilize her unique skills for national emergency preparedness. She would undergo training with all branches of the military, becoming a specialist in inter-service coordination and emergency response innovation. This proposal addressed several problems simultaneously. It provided legal resolution without damaging prosecution of a national hero. It satisfied all service branches by giving them access to Sarah's capabilities, and it created a new model for handling similar situations that might arise in the future. Sarah's decision would normally be straightforward, but she had developed concerns about how her story was being used for political purposes. The media coverage had made her a celebrity, but it had also simplified her story in ways that ignored the serious legal and ethical issues involved in her actions. During a private meeting with Secretary Chen, Sarah expressed her reservations. "I didn't steal that aircraft to become famous or to prove a point about military procedures. I did it because people were dying and I could help. I'm worried that all this attention is missing the real lesson." Chen was impressed by Sarah's thoughtfulness and her continued focus on the underlying issues rather than personal benefits. "What do you think the real lesson should be?" he asked. Sarah's answer would later be quoted in military leadership courses and congressional testimony. "The lesson is that systems and procedures are important, but they should never become more important than the people they're supposed to protect. Every person in uniform, from mechanics to generals, needs to remember that our job is serving others, not just following orders." This perspective convinced Chen that Sarah's value went beyond her technical skills or her ability to coordinate emergency responses. She had demonstrated moral leadership and strategic thinking that could benefit military culture at the highest levels. The final agreement was announced at a joint press conference that attracted national media attention. Sarah would serve a 5-year commitment in a newly created position as Inter-Service Emergency Coordination Specialist, with training and assignments rotating between all military branches. Her legal issues would be resolved through administrative rather than criminal proceedings, with her service record reflecting both her violations and her extraordinary contributions. The arrangement satisfied most stakeholders while creating precedents for handling similar situations in the future. Sarah would have opportunities to work with each service branch, developing new approaches to emergency response that incorporated lessons learned from Cedar Ridge. But perhaps most importantly, the agreement recognized that sometimes the most valuable military assets are people who can think beyond established procedures while maintaining dedication to serving others. Sarah's willingness to risk everything to save lives had demonstrated qualities that the military needed to cultivate, rather than simply punish. As Sarah prepared for the next phase of her career, she reflected on how stealing a warplane had led to opportunities she never could have imagined. She had broken rules to save lives, and now she was being asked to help rewrite those rules to prevent similar emergencies from happening again. The transformation from civilian contractor to military specialist would not be easy. Each service branch had different cultures, different priorities, and different approaches to problem solving. Sarah would need to learn not just their individual systems, but how to bridge the gaps between them to create more effective emergency response capabilities. Her first assignment would be developing new training programs that combined technical expertise with moral decision-making. The military had realized that Sarah's success came not just from her mechanical knowledge, but from her willingness to take personal responsibility for the consequences of her actions. The Cedar Ridge incident had shown that the most advanced technology and best-trained personnel could still fail if they couldn't adapt quickly to unexpected situations. Sarah's story would become a teaching tool for military leaders at all levels, demonstrating that sometimes the most important skill is knowing when to break the rules. As she signed the agreement that would formalize her new role, Sarah thought about the A-10 that had carried her into this new life. The aircraft had been returned to service after thorough inspection, but it would always be known as the plane that a mechanic had stolen to save lives. In military circles, it had already become legendary, a symbol of what was possible when technical knowledge combined with moral courage. The residents of Cedar Ridge had established a scholarship fund in Sarah's name for students pursuing careers in aviation maintenance and emergency response. They understood that her willingness to risk everything for strangers had saved their community, and they wanted to ensure that future generations would be inspired by her example. Sarah's journey from civilian contractor to inter-service specialist was just beginning, but she had already changed how the military thought about emergency response, individual initiative, and the importance of putting human lives above bureaucratic procedures. The woman who stole a warplane had become the catalyst for reforms that would make the entire military more effective at protecting innocent lives. She stole a warplane to protect lives. Now every branch demands her on their side. 2 years after, stealing an A-10 Thunderbolt II to save the town of Cedar Ridge, Sarah Martinez had become one of the most recognizable figures in the American military. Her official title, Inter-Service Emergency Coordination Specialist, barely captured the Scope of her influence on military culture and emergency response doctrine. She had trained with elite units from every branch of service, developed new coordination protocols that were being adopted worldwide, and established herself as the military's leading expert on rapid emergency response. The transformation had not been easy. Sarah's first year of military training was grueling, as she had to master not just the technical aspects of each service branch, but their distinct cultures and command philosophies. Air Force precision, Army adaptability, Navy innovation, and Marine Corps determination each contributed different elements to her developing expertise. Her reputation for unconventional solutions had grown throughout her training. During a joint exercise simulating a nuclear plant emergency, Sarah had coordinated resources from all 4 service branches to establish an evacuation timeline that was 40% faster than previous best practices. Her approach involved treating the entire operation as an integrated system rather than separate service contributions, a perspective that came naturally from her engineering background. The success of Sarah's methods was being recognized at the highest levels of government. The president had personally commended her innovations during a White House ceremony, noting that her techniques had been credited with saving lives in 3 major disasters since Cedar Ridge. Foreign military delegations were requesting briefings on her coordination methods, and several NATO allies had expressed interest in developing similar cross-service specialist positions. But Sarah's greatest impact was on the people she worked with directly. Lieutenant Jennifer Adams, an Air Force pilot who had trained with Sarah, described the experience as transformative. She taught us to see beyond our individual missions to understand how everything connects. When you're coordinating a rescue operation, you're not just flying a helicopter or manning a radio. You're part of a living system that exists to protect people. This systemic thinking had become Sarah's signature contribution to military doctrine. Traditional military training emphasized chain of command and specialized expertise, but Sarah's approach emphasized understanding how different capabilities could be combined to create solutions that no single service could achieve alone. The test of Sarah's new methods came during Hurricane Maria's devastating impact on Puerto Rico. The storm had caused widespread infrastructure damage, leaving millions without power, clean water, or medical services. Traditional military response would have involved separate operations by each service branch, coordinated through federal emergency management agencies. Instead, Sarah was given unprecedented authority to coordinate a unified military response that treated the entire Caribbean as a single operational theater. She established herself aboard the USS Kearsarge, a Navy amphibious assault ship that became the floating command center for operations involving over 50 aircraft, 30 ships, and thousands of military personnel from all service branches. The Puerto Rico operation showcased everything Sarah had learned since Cedar Ridge. Air Force transport aircraft delivered supplies to remote areas, while Navy ships provided mobile hospitals and communication platforms. Army ground units distributed aid and restored infrastructure, while Marine Corps expeditionary forces secured critical facilities. But instead of operating separately, all these resources were integrated through Sarah's coordination system. The results were extraordinary. The military response delivered aid to isolated communities within hours instead of days, coordinated civilian and military medical resources to prevent disease outbreaks, and restored critical infrastructure at a pace that exceeded all previous disaster response operations. Most importantly, the unified approach prevented the bureaucratic delays and resource conflicts that had plagued previous multi-service operations. International observers were amazed by the efficiency of the response. Colonel Marie Dubois, a French military attaché who witnessed the operations, reported back to European NATO headquarters that the American military had developed coordination capabilities that represented a fundamental advance in emergency response doctrine. Sarah's success in Puerto Rico led to her promotion to colonel, making her one of the youngest people ever to achieve that rank through the inter-service program. More significantly, her methods were being incorporated into military training programs worldwide, fundamentally changing how armed forces approached emergency response and interagency cooperation. The personal cost of Sarah's rapid rise had been significant. The intense training schedule, constant travel, and enormous responsibility had left little time for personal relationships or normal life experiences. She had become a public figure whose every decision was scrutinized by media, military analysts, and political observers. During a rare, quiet moment aboard the Kearsarge, Sarah reflected on how her life had changed since that night when she decided to steal a warplane. She had achieved recognition and influence beyond anything she had imagined, but she sometimes wondered if the bureaucracy and politics surrounding her work were distracting from the simple moral principle that had motivated her original action. Her concerns were addressed during a private conversation with General Patricia Williams, who had become both a mentor and advocate for Sarah's career. Williams had watched Sarah's development with pride, but she also understood the pressures that came with such rapid advancement and public attention. "Do you regret what you did at Cedar Ridge?" Williams asked during their meeting. Sarah's answer came without hesitation. "Never. Those people are alive because someone acted when action was needed. Everything that's happened since then has been about making sure similar situations can be handled better in the future." Williams nodded, recognizing the moral clarity that had made Sarah so effective. The military needs people who understand that our ultimate purpose is protecting others, not just following procedures. What you've built goes far beyond emergency response. You've shown us how to be better at our fundamental mission. The conversation helped Sarah understand that her influence extended beyond operational improvements to cultural change within the military itself. Young officers were joining the service inspired by her example, seeking careers that would allow them to make similar contributions. Military academies were incorporating her story into leadership courses, using her decision at Cedar Ridge as a case study in moral courage and innovative thinking. As Sarah prepared for her next assignment, developing emergency response protocols for potential terrorist attacks on civilian infrastructure, she realized that her journey had come full circle. She had started as a mechanic focused on maintaining aircraft systems, evolved into a specialist in coordinating complex operations, and was now helping to reshape military culture itself. The A-10 she had stolen was still in service, now carrying a small plaque commemorating the Cedar Ridge rescue. Pilots who flew the aircraft considered it an honor, knowing they were operating the machine that had launched one of the most significant innovations in military emergency response history. Sarah's legacy was already secure, but her impact was still growing. The woman who had stolen a warplane to protect innocent lives had demonstrated that sometimes the greatest service to one's country required the courage to act beyond the boundaries of conventional authority. Her story would continue inspiring future generations of military personnel to remember that their highest duty was not to regulations or procedures, but to the people they had sworn to protect. In military history, there had been many examples of individual heroism and tactical innovation, but Sarah Martinez had achieved something rarer. She had changed the fundamental way an entire military establishment approached its mission. The mechanic who stole a warplane had become the catalyst for transformation that would save countless lives for decades to come.